Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by the great Henry Jackman. On this episode, we will focus on three of his most recent projects: the Netflix film Mosul, the Showtime's miniseries The Comey Rule, and Cherry, a film directed by the Russo brothers. It is my pleasure to welcome back Henry Jackman.
Well, thanks very much for having me again.
It's great to have you back on my show. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate that. And Henry, at first, I would like to talk about Mosul just a little bit. The experience of Mosul and reducing the score to, let's say, a bare minimum. What was the primary objective of you and the filmmakers, Matthew, Michael, Carnahan, and also the Russo brothers?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I would describe Mosul as a very minimalist score, a very textual score, which I don't know, if you think about something like Jumanji, it's like the exact opposite
Yes.
of something like Jumanji, and rightly so, because Mosul, it's not a documentary, but the style of filmmaking is very realistic, very psychologically credible. There's absolutely no fantasy, and there's no need or cause for there to be unnecessary narrative incursion, into the movie from the music. And a lot of that comes from Matthew Carnahan is a profoundly intelligent, very politically astute and aware person, also a very good director and a writer. He wrote Mosul. And, his background, he spent time in Washington. He is familiar and friendly with a number of, high-level think tank people and politicians and so on. So the feeling of Mosul is not like a Hollywood or commercial representation of what's happening in Mosul, where, you can just tell from the writing, for example, instead of casting a well-known American actor and making the story about, an American, it's nothing to do with that. It's a foreign language movie. Everything is subtitled and it's very realistic. So when you take into consideration all those filmmaking choices, the realism, the credibility, the research, the accuracy of what life is really like in Mosul, that has an effect on the music. And what that means is it's not appropriate to turn, the main protagonists. I mean, it sort of centers around Walid and Suhail and all these, there's a sort of core group of Iraqis, but it would not be appropriate to give them, a heroic theme or an endurance theme. And Matthew was very sophisticated in responding to small adjustments of texture. He didn't want big, invasive, thematic gestures. He loved the score to be the manipulation of tone and texture. And so it was quite a challenge, because you still have to do the storytelling and describe the tension and the relief. It's an interesting discipline, and one that actually working with Paul Greengrass was very helpful, because Captain Phillips has a slightly similar attitude in that, Paul Greengrass comes also from a documentary journalism background and doesn't want to make the Americans the heroes and the Somalis the bad guys. It's a lot more politically neutral.
It's funny you should mention Paul Greengrass and also Captain Phillips, because I was going to ask you about this anyway, and I believe we did talk about this previously. I mean, you wrote music for Captain Phillips, and then Paul Greengrass, as I remember it, kept telling you the music is basically too active. There is too much. I want less and I want less. Did you initially have a bolder score in mind for Mosul, and then you realized it's just a bit too much and I just want, some vocals, cello, and the dissonance and the manipulation, if you will?
That's a really good question. I think the first bit of writing was already pretty minimal. I mean, it wasn't really thematic. But then once I started working with Matthew, it probably went even deeper into what is the essential textures and sounds we need. And if there's anything inessential, let's just get rid of it. So it was already on gear 4 of textural minimalism. And then collaborating with Matthew, we probably went to gear 5.
So you basically were stripping away the bells and the whistles, if that's a proper way.
If a sound is pleasing to hear, but it's not really performing an active narrative function, or we have maybe two sounds doing that. He was always on the lookout to what is the absolute essential. And when we have that, let's not have anything else.
This could also be described as an artistic discipline behind the movie scoring process, as in less is more at times.
That's absolutely true. And less is more with a certain kind of filmmaking. However, you could imagine in a Star Wars movie or a Harry Potter movie, if you had a drone for 3 minutes, you'd get fired after about a week. Because the exact opposite is needed. Something that is, supposing you were doing Ralph Breaks the Internet, when they first get sucked down the router and you see this new world of the internet. The exact opposite is required. Something effervescent, something virtuoso, something that combines orchestra and electronics and is a grand and effusive statement is what's needed. So it completely depends on what the type of filmmaking is. But you're right. In the case of Mosul, the general attitude, let's strip away anything that doesn't have a directly obvious narrative functional use. It was a very good principle.
Mosul basically is, or could be described as realistic, melodramatic filmmaking, in this case, without the big orchestral accompaniment, and you use simple underpinnings to achieve your goal, which was very interesting. And when I watched the film, I was like, I'm 40 minutes into the movie. Basically, I heard very little score, if any, and then towards the end in the third act, there was a little bit more score, and also the vocals and the end credits, and they used the cello, and I believe I also heard the vocoder, used the vocoder in there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and yes, you're also right that in the natural course, even with a very sort of realistic art film of this nature, that it's very natural that in the third act, even though it's realistic, the narrative strands of the film are coming to their conclusion. So it's natural that there are some more significant cues that are more prominent. I mean, especially right at the end when I don't want to give too much away, but when the rescue sort of finally happens at the end, I mean, it's similar to, even Captain Phillips, which had a lot of disciplined tension cues. Of course, there are the final couple of cues in the movie, particularly, when Captain Phillips, played by Tom Hanks, is finally rescued. You do get the opportunity in that third act to allow the music to blossom, even in the context of one of these more minimalist type scores.
Yeah, great. And thank you very much for elaborating on that, Henry. And now I would like to talk about the Comey Rule, Showtime's two-part political drama miniseries starring Jeff Daniels as former FBI Director James Comey and Brendan Gleeson as Donald Trump. Could you please describe the world of politics in musical terms? How did you experience that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the way the director, Billy Ray, I spoke to him a lot before I started this particular project. And my way into, because of course, again, it's a very well-researched, very well-written, regardless of if you're, a Trump hater or a Trump neutral or a Trump supporter, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, the one thing I don't think you can argue with is the portrayal of the discussions and the procedures are very well researched, which is a very difficult thing to do if you're going to make a show that lasts, 2 sets of 50 minutes or 2 sets of an hour. And really, it's a lot of people talking in rooms, but the writing was very good. So the drama managed to come across. But my route into it musically, especially in my discussions with Billy, the director, was not to get caught up in any political side, but to think of this as the challenge that Comey faced, meaning he's a man who has devotion to duty and has a belief in the ideal of being director of the FBI. It's not quite a love affair, like a romantic love affair, but he has a devotional love of the idea of the institution. So my route into it musically was like, okay, I'm going to write a piece away from picture called I think I titled it Love of an Ideal. And I need to write a piece that somehow describes this slightly lofty ambition of the idealistic idea of an institution. And I spent a bit of time thinking about that, and I was quite proud with the outcome of it, because one of the obvious things to do would be to use some of the influence of 20th century American, like Aaron Copland, and no doubt the solo trumpet would have been used. And I avoided all of that because I thought it would just come out sounding a bit like Captain America and would make Comey feel like some sort of superhero, and it would bring a bias to the show and make him feel heroic, which we didn't want to do. So funnily enough, the piece that I wrote that's on the CD or on iTunes called Love of an Ideal, I actually was more influenced. Funny, it sounds very counterintuitive because it's European, not American. I'm actually a big fan of Thomas Tallis and of, 16th century devotional church music, which has a type of harmony that's a little bit different to diatonic harmony. And so the harmony is a little bit modal. Now, even though that sounds a bit counterintuitive, because that kind of music originally comes from the church, it comes from European church music and is devotional with the idea of, Christian devotional music in the worship of God. But if you take that harmonic language and get rid of the choir, get rid of the organ, but use some of this harmonic language that comes from devotional Protestant music, that's the sort of foundation of this piece called Love of an Ideal. And I found that it was quite effective because it meant that the theme had something objective that wasn't personal, that had something that felt idealistic and devotional, but it didn't feel like American superhero, because the ultimate musicological DNA of this type of approach actually comes out of devotional ecclesiastical music. And the director was very happy with this result because he could feel that the music had this noble devotional sense, but didn't feel too heroic, coming out of the lineage of, Fanfare for the Common Man or Aaron Copland. So that would be too obvious and make Comey feel like he was some sort of superhero. And so it was an interesting route to take, but I'm glad I did it.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that. And to me, it's also a good versus evil story, if you will. I mean, you have a new FBI director who is respected and also beloved by his co-workers versus a disreputable president.
That's true. Although in the music, I did everything I could to make sure. I mean, what I didn't want to do is like I just said, with the Comey theme, it wasn't heroic. And by the same token, I spent ages on the Trump musical material precisely not to make him evil. You're absolutely right. If you go through a lot of Trump statements and everything, he said all sorts of somewhat disreputable things. But in the context of this story, what was more important to get across in the music for Trump it was more that it was from Comey's perspective. So instead of writing music that made Trump some sort of evil villain, the important function of Trump in this particular story is how disruptive and unsettling it is for Comey. Because if you're head of the FBI, of course, there are so many protocols and precedents of how the system works. and expectations on how to do your job. And of course, what he found very quickly when he had discussions with Trump is he found it extremely unsettling because Trump's modus operandi had no respect for protocol or for the constitutional regularities of how these things are supposed to take place. So that's very, very unsettling. It means you're trying to do your job and the floor that you're standing on keeps collapsing. So you don't really know where you are. It's almost like you go into a fever of not, you don't. So the music for Trump, I made it more unsettling and disruptive rather than making a judgmental type of music that signified moral wrongdoing. I wanted to make an unsettling, spidery, kind of serpentine type of music for Trump, which more represented, from Comey's perspective, that there's something toxic about their interactions so that he can't keep a clear head and he can't find his way, because every time he tries to do something, he finds he's on uncertain ground and things are contradicted, and just the way Trump goes about interacting is extremely unconventional and disturbing, which is not quite the same thing as a good old-fashioned villain, like in a superhero movie. So I was quite careful, for example, in the scale that I use for Trump was not an unusual. Quite often I'll use an octatonic scale for villains. And I actually was very careful to keep a diatonic scale and just try to find little methods of breaking up the rhythm and the very careful use of which notes I was using for Trump, so that the scale wasn't too heavily evil. But there are a number of things about the Trump material that are not what you expect. So there's an uncertainty and especially in the rhythmic grammar of it, and you end up feeling unsettled more than a direct sense of evil.
Yes, absolutely. And that's very interesting, Henry. And you can tell by watching the show and the material that James Comey is feeling very uncomfortable also during the dinner scene with President Trump. And then he also starts taking notes of the conversation because he knows later on it might be extremely useful, because he feels, I believe, that he needs to take the notes in order to not only to remember what he said, but also as a legal safety net, if you will.
Yes, to protect himself. And also because one of the huge misunderstandings about Trump, just generally politically, is that he's somehow stupid or he's an idiot. What happened to Comey was he goes, if you go into a meeting with Trump thinking you're going to handle the meeting and you know where you stand and things are going to be clear, most people just get blown out of the room because he moves so quickly and he unsettles you. He says things where you're even wondering whether it is appropriate, and he moves very quickly between different topics. So the idea that he is an easy adversary is completely wrong. He's a very, very tricky adversary where, you may go for a dinner, it may last 40 minutes, but when you come out of that dinner, you're likely to be very confused and not exactly know what the hell's going on.
Yes.
And so anyone with the feeling he could be underestimated would quickly find that they lose their footing.
Yes. I think it might be easy, or the easy way out, just to dismiss him as an idiot, as you just said. There is a danger.
Oh, for sure.
And the show also depicts not only politics, but the effects it has on people and the world. And you, of course, had to be the musical part of this equation.
That's right. But again, we always try to be as careful as possible. Not what we didn't want is the accusation, oh, I get it. So here's a TV show put together by a bunch of liberals that just keeps making Trump look terrible and, et cetera, et cetera. So what I always try to do with the music is support the story of Comey, and his family, and not make cues and musical grand statements that were like objective third-party music that's giving you like an overall judgment about this president. It's more to do with the tension, because obviously, just from a personal point of view, it's an extremely stressful situation. If you're director of the FBI and you're trying to do your job in circumstances where you're finding it almost impossible to keep your footing in relation to your relationship with the president and your family, and you have to make these decisions where it almost doesn't matter which decision you make, it's going to be a bad one. And your family disagree with you very strongly. Forget about, which side of the political spectrum you're on. That's just a dramatic tension that you need to portray, because it centers around Comey's family and the tension between him and his daughters and his wife. And so there was a great opportunity, again, to write music to support that. But again, doing it in a way, this is where that harmonic language that, very often it would just be strings and piano, but using these harmonies I was talking about from this original piece, Love of an Ideal, gave it a certain timelessness. So it didn't feel too like it was pushing onto somebody's side. And that's what I liked about the Love of an Ideal theme, and the harmony it uses has a certain subtlety to it, because really what the music's showing is the challenge that Comey has, because he has this love of an ideal and it's being challenged and threatened. So I would rather approach it in that slightly more musically sophisticated way, rather than in the objective way of trying to write music which signifies a good and a bad side of the political spectrum. Because don't forget, apart from anything else, there are millions of people who are Trump supporters. The idea of the music is not to make a statement about whether it's a good idea to be a Trump supporter or not. The idea of the music is to follow the story of Comey, who had a job that became so difficult constitutionally that he faced difficulties probably no other director has faced. And that's true regardless of which side you're on. You can still enjoy the story of how challenging that was, whether you're on one side of the politics or the other side, because you're seeing a story of the director and his family and how he tried to keep doing his job and the decisions he tried to make to do the right thing by way of precedent and constitution, while he was being faced with situations that no one had to face before, particularly with what to do about opening the email case with Hillary Clinton. Whichever decision he made was going to have consequences, whether he liked it or not. I mean, it was an impossible situation.
Yes, absolutely. That's very well put, and thank you. And yes, I mean, you faced a pretty difficult challenge. I mean, you had to stay neutral on some occasions, and I think you handled this very well, if I may say so. And Henry, I would like to briefly talk about the evolution of a sequence and the respective cue. I mean, the series basically doesn't have a main title sequence, it has an end title sequence. What can you tell me about that and the music and how you approached it and how you managed to underscore that?
That's a very good question, because it was very enjoyable Billy Ray being a very sophisticated writer and director. It was in the natural course of things that a lot of the music cues were not demonstrative and too forceful, because of course, many of the scenes are dialogue scenes and there's a general subtlety, to the whole thing. And so by the end of the show, I had all these subtle iterations of the Comey theme, the Love of an Ideal theme. And of course, when it came to the end credits, thank goodness, Billy was like, I'd love to hear the Love of an Ideal theme, but now with more of and I said, well, let me write one that has, more like a set piece, the sort of, the version that you might play in the concert hall, the more forthright version. And so the end credit sequence was a version of the Comey theme that was the more demonstrative, the more orchestrated, the more orchestral tutti, more, it has more counter lines, and, it's just more developed in a way that was not necessarily possible for the dialogue cues, because of course it would have been too intrusive. So it was a nice opportunity to do a more significantly orchestrated full rendition of the Comey theme.
Great. Thank you very much, Henry. And now I would like to dive into Cherry a bit. You worked again with the Russo brothers, Joe and Anthony, and I've got a great quote here. They said, "This is Henry's most sublime work, beautiful, poignant, riotous, devious, breathtaking in its ability to manifest such complex tones while unifying them at the same time. He is truly a master of the craft."
I should probably just retire now then. Oh, it's all going to go downhill from here. Well, that is the biggest compliment ever. And I think part of the reason, I would love to just absorb all of those compliments, but the truth is that one of the reasons you are able to achieve something which in the view of the Russo brothers is, musically really effective and interesting, is really down also to their creative vision, because you can't write music in a vacuum. You are rising to the challenge and responding to the filmmaking that's in front of you. One of the very primary reasons why I pushed myself in a more experimental and in a different way to any other movie I've done is really a compliment to them, because Cherry is one of the most interesting films I've ever seen. It's just it's original, it's unusual. It has elements of romance, but in a very untraditional way. It has elements of decadence and drugs and PTSD. It has elements of war and psychological confusion. It's like it has elements of Deer Hunter and Drugstore Cowboy and Dr. Zhivago all rolled into one. And not only that, the actual filmmaking, the creative decisions that they chose to make in how to put the film together was sometimes unusual and stylized, and different chapters have different feels. So it really was a consummate piece. Before I got involved, it was already something that was extremely rare and unusual, like a real gem of artistic imagination. So if that's the case, that means that as a composer, you have to rise to that challenge, which means, if you really work hard enough, you may be able to find something you've never found before. Now, so obviously I can take some credit for that, but the reason you get pushed into trying to find something so unusual and hopefully unique really starts with the directors. And, it was a really interesting process. I spent a lot of time writing pieces away from picture. I wrote a Cherry suite that's about 10 minutes long. And there's an arrangement of that piece that got released called The Come Down, which is a 9-minute piece, is sort of very, very much based on that original Cherry suite I wrote. I wrote all sorts of extremely experimental pieces, some of which stayed in the cupboard, but some of which were used. I used a lot of different ideas. I used analog synths. I used live recordings with some of my own hopeless playing, using a collection of extremely eclectic and counterintuitive instruments that I just cobbled together without really having too much of an idea. That I was using an mbira and a zither and an Andean harp, and just all sorts of uncautious experiments took place. And I was lucky to be able to do that with the encouragement of Joe and Anthony, who had so much faith in me, and who themselves were so open-minded. They allowed an extensive period of musical invention just to see what was possible. And so I think we ended up with a really unusual score, which covers a lot of different themes and ideas, and has quite a range from very unusual guitars, very unstable tones for PTSD and the Iraq scenes, an almost sort of Vangelis type analog synth vocabulary that is also part of the film. It's extremely unusual. I honestly don't think I've done anything quite like it before, and I think the biggest reason for that is really starts with their creative vision. So it's very nice of them to say all those wonderful things about me, but the truth is that they are responsible in a way for providing the environment to allow that to happen.
Yes, yes. But the quote is very interesting, and I think it reads like a love letter to your work. And I think you can't ask for more from a collaborative standpoint, I guess.
Well, no, that's what I mean. But I should probably just retire now. It's only going to go downhill from. It's like winning the World Cup if you're a 21-year-old soccer player or something. You probably won't win too.
Don't think about retirement. I mean,
no, I'm only joking, but no, I take it. It's only because I'm British. It's that terrible tradition where the English people cannot. They're not very good at receiving compliments. But being serious for a second, the fact that they said that, I do take very seriously because I know what it means to them, and I know that they don't use words carelessly. So that does mean a lot to me.
Henry, from what I've heard so far, the music has a very emotional side to it, and it also feels hypnotic. So I greatly enjoyed the music which I was able to listen to up front. And judging from what I've seen so far from the trailers and how the story has been described to me, you basically, if I'm not mistaken, had to follow the story of a young man who makes bad decisions and who finds himself in challenging life circumstances.
That's exactly right. The beginning of the movie really sets up the character as being a fish out of water in every conceivable respect, with very few life options. And a love story is also set up. And then, it goes through these various chapters. But quite a lot of the thematic ingredients musically are all present in the first act of the movie. You get the kind of sweeping analog synth usage. You get this curious ukulele, umbira, zither piece that was useful for Emily. You get a number of these different strands, and even though it's not a traditional score, there's a theme that is established right at the beginning, which just keeps showing up in various different mutated forms and culminates in that very last piece, which you've heard, called The Come Down. So it's a slightly unusual mixture of, it's quite esoteric and eclectic. So there's many different strands, but actually there is some thematic unity. So it doesn't feel too chaotic. And that was very satisfying to be able to maintain an element of eclecticism in the variation of these different ideas, but use enough of the cherry idea in the theme in its various different ways, in the piano, in the synths, in very disturbing quarter tone versions on the cello, so that by the time you get to the end, you still have a type of aesthetic satisfaction that has derived from the consistency of a theme, so that you don't descend into structural chaos.
Great. And it sounds like a perfect opportunity to explore soundscapes, to make a person human yet dangerous at the same time. So it's an emotional ambiguity, if you will.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are many different. So, for example, there might be a cue which has piano, which I put through a vocoder, and it's almost sort of an ecstatic. It's a sort of John Cage, Brian Eno ecstatic type experience. But then later there are cues which are extremely unsettling and abstract, and more a combination of manipulating organic and electronic textures, which sound sort of moody and modular and fatalistic, that were used for the Iraq training and for, let's say, the bank robbery at the end. I mean, and those are sort of wildly different it's not just that the textures are different, the grammatical construction of the music's very different. I mean, there's a cue towards the end that's about 7 minutes long that is a highly minimal, it's the sort of thing you might have found on Warp Records, you know, as an electronic artist. And that's a long way from some of the other stuff. But somehow when you add it all together, it just about seems to work.
Henry, now we have covered quite a lot of ground, but as I understand, you are also very busy at the moment. Can you disclose what you are currently working on?
Yes, I'm just engaged with two very interesting projects. One's called Ron's Gone Wrong, which is the first animated movie for the newly formed UK company Locksmith Productions. And it's a fantastically innovative and quirky and very emotional animated film. And then also, I've got the great privilege to again be working with Kevin Feige's Marvel Universe with a show which involves Winter Soldier and the Falcon.
Great.
And I'll say no more than that in case I give anything away, but I'm allowed to say that much.
Great. Henry, is there anything else you would like to add? Anything else that comes to mind which we might not have covered?
No, I think your questions were extremely diligent.
Henry, I would like to thank you for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. Again, for me, I had a great time talking to you as usual, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I always enjoy. You always have very thoughtful questions that show that you've done your research and you ask questions that produce an interesting conversation. So I'm grateful.
I'm looking forward to many more conversations down the road.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.